Tonight we'll be hearing from a couple of superior talents. One, Chris Cleave, flown in here especially for this event from London yesterday afternoon actually. And Brendan Jones, a proud Philly boy who loves the city so deeply that he's moved his life to Sitka, Alaska, 3,000 miles away to live on a tugboat. I didn't realize it had two stories, Chris remarked after seeing a photo of it. It's a massive thing, the World War II vintage tugboat, at a reception last night at the home of Brenda's mother and red pen wielding editor Kathy Gosner. Well, yes, it had two stories, but eventually it had several more, including in its fictionalized form, the love interest of Tara Marconi, the two-fisted protagonist in Brendan's new book, The Alaskan Laundry, for sale in the lobby, I believe. The Alaskan Laundry, I happened to mention the name to an intriguing librarian from Madrid who was sitting next to me on the Paoli Local, or the previously named Paoli Local yesterday. A strange name, she said in a very alluring accent. I said, the vast frozen land of Alaska was a good place to leave your old life behind, and quoting Brendan's book, to wash away your past. I didn't mention the part about some folks getting pretty dirty in the process. So why are these two talented authors sharing the same stage tonight? Brendan, a handful of brilliant New York Times op-ed pieces under his belt, and fresh off a Wallace Stegner writing fellowship at Stanford, making his first trip to the plate as a novelist. And Chris, an acclaimed wordsmith whose first book, Incendiary, was published in 20 countries, and his second, Little B, a New York Times bestseller, already a proven slugger. Reason number one, Chris's heartbreakingly poignant Everyone Brave is Forgiven and Brendan's Alaskan Odyssey have both just been released. Reason number two, but there is a thematic link. Both feature a young woman heroine. Brendan's a defiant South Philly girl finding herself on a rough salmon fishing boat off an island that is Sitka in all but name. Chris is Mary North, a social butterfly caught in the darkening web of a London being dismantled by Nazi bombs. They're moving characters. The Laundry's Tara Marconi falling in love with, you guessed it, the big lug of a tugboat on her way to reconciling herself with her true home. And Mary North, left wounded by the war and left still searching for healing. Their stories both of loves and rebellions, and I'll leave it to them to delve a little bit more deeply into that. But not before tipping a hat to Chris's dogged recasting of the true story of his grandfather stationed in part of the novel on the besieged and starving island of Malta, and his love letters back home to who would become his grandmother in London. Chris actually visited that yellow rock redoubt and tried to live himself on the soldiers' very meager rations, lasting about 3 weeks before he, I guess, broke out the spam or what have you there. And of course, Brendan drew on his commercial fishing and its keen eye for Alaskan style and the endless quirks of tugboat maintenance. His lawyer wife, Rachel, has her own view and her own priorities, and that is, 1, get a baby-sized life preserver for Haley, and 2, a leash. So that's her. Am I correct? Yes. absolutely. I'll leave it to that for now, and just close with this quote from Chris's book, which he writes that London, after its trial by fire and the punishing bombing, was a city dying to begin, as I expect you are as well. Please, the talent.
I grew up in Philly, and my mother worked here at the library, and I remember very well going around the back there and waiting for her to come out and spending time with Elliot Shellcrott, who was always just the kindest, greatest guy. And mostly being here watching authors, listening to authors. And I'm, of course, a great fan of libraries, but also just seeing authors as a young kid was really, really special. Chinua Achebe and Sharon Olds and Richard Ford, and seeing these people in the flesh was so great. So I can't tell you what a cool thrill it is to be here reading. I gotta say, the last time I was this dressed up at, well, probably forever, but at the library was my prom, which actually happened on the roof of the library. And I came here with Jane Lynch and Jeff Marazzo, who I think is some here in the crowd, and I figured tonight would be he dressed in a white tuxedo that night, and I figured tonight would be the one time I'd be better dressed than Jeff Marazzo, so I'm really happy about that. And I also just really wanted to give a quick shout out to teachers. My English teacher, Meg Rabinowitz, is here, and they have a funny way of sitting on your shoulder when you're doing crazy things like commercial fishing or being in Alaska or trying to finish up a carpentry job, and they just whisper at you. Don't ever forget about the writing. And I can't say enough or talk about enough how important it was to have that voice from high school, just always saying what you're doing is worth something. There are stakes in what you're doing. And that was an engine that definitely let me finish this book. So I think I'm going to do a short reading, and then we'll have Chris up here. I'll say a couple things just about sources. I'd love to talk a little bit about sources and where the material from the book comes from, because I think Chris's book, he looked very much into his grandfather's or grandparents' correspondence, and we both have letters in our books, these epistemological stories. So that's really curious. I think that we're kind of outdated in that sense, but I'm proud of it. So this is right when Tara Marconi arrives in Alaska from Philadelphia. She's had a falling out with her father, and she gets to this island. She's just kind of bowled away. Thorns snagged her jeans as they picked their way along the sandy bank. Scrubby, dim beaches with stalks of flattened, sodden grass stretched out on the far side of the stream. Screeching gulls, white as paper, wheeled against the dark sky. The sight of water comforted her, how it curled behind rocks, shadows of stones beneath the rush. And then one of the stones freed itself from the stream bed and darted upriver. A few others followed, and then with an intake of breath, she realized these were fish, thousands of fish finning in the current. "There's your smell," Fritz murmured, "dying salmon." She watched, stunned, as a gull took a couple of steps in the shallows before jamming its beak into the stomach of a fish carcass. Orange eggs spilled into the current, and Tara cupped a hand over her mouth. A grotesque-looking creature, backlit, tore a strip of flesh from a salmon struggling in its talons. It swallowed the meat in gulps, head cocked in her direction. This was an eagle, she realized, not much smaller than the brass statues outside the Central Post Office in Philadelphia. "Pink salmon, we call them humpies," Fritz said. "Males like that?" He pointed to a fish with a hump along its back. "It'll be your job to toss them down the chute. Females, we give a whack on the head with a stick of alder, slide open the stomach, and shuck out the eggs." She put a hand up. "Hold on. Coos told me this was a hatchery, like we're hatching fish, not killing them. He gazed at her, his melon of a head tilted to one side. Behind him, the eagle lofted into a tree. How about you hold that thought until tomorrow, Fritz said. But tomorrow suddenly seemed far away. Right now, she was thinking of getting back on that ferry, zipping up in her sleeping bag and snuggling beneath the heat lamps. Far from this gun-toting man, these zombie fish decaying on the banks, blood-hungry bears and prehistoric birds. So if the females are killed, what about the males, she asked, ignoring his comment. Oh, we get a few studs to spray over a bucket of eggs, and the rest, like I said, go down the chute, which dumps, he ricocheted one hand off the other, right into my crab pots. Skookum setup. Makes for great stuffing come Thanksgiving. And she bit her lip. The question of whether she'd make it to the holiday hung in the air. This man was challenging her, she decided, some manner of Alaskan hazing. A dull anger lit up beneath her breastbone. The last thing she needed was some fat boss ordering her around. If she wanted to, she could be in New York City by Connor's side in less than a week. She could reassess and make a new plan. When they returned to the parking lot, she saw the bright brake lights of one last car receding into the boat. She stood by the flatbed. Her shoes were sandy and damp. Fritz heaved himself into the bench seat. And then, across the water, behind a number of smaller islands, a thumbnail of sunshine along the rim of the volcano. Just like Mount Etna in the photos her mother had shown her, a dark cone to guide the fishermen of Asitretsa home each night. Above her, clouds opened to a patch of blue. We call those sucker holes, Fritz said, for those suckers who think it's about to get sunny. She looked away, leaning into the truck window, and among the squished muffin wrappers and styrofoam coffee cups, stretched out on the bench, was a hefty white dog with a black and gold streak up his back. This here's Kita, Fritz said. The dog peered up at her with clear brown eyes, his whiskers twitching. The smell of mildew and tobacco and wet fur in the truck was almost worse than the dying fish. Fritz hooked his thumbs into his suspenders. Listen, Tara, he said, staring through the mud-streaked windshield. I sure wouldn't think any the less of you if you got right back on that ferry. Save us both a lot of trouble. She waited, listening to his heavy breathing. Your cousin Akuzio, he was here, 10 years ago? Long enough to forget what winters are like and the sting of hard work. He was right. Cold sky, the coming winter, the nauseating smells. Even this lumbering, weary man. I don't need this, not now. If she didn't go crawling back to Connor, and part of her wanted to explain that this was all some awful mistake, she could at least find someplace dry. The Southwest, Santa Fe, where Akuzio was working, get a job scooping ice cream, find a boxing gym, train in the afternoons, just be alone and get her head on straight. I should add, Fritz said, rubbing his eyes, that the last thing I need this fall is someone dragging ass at my operation. We got production goals, it's hop skip, and I sure don't take well to slackers, especially as we start prepping for next year's run. The heat beneath her breastbone spread, and she thought of her father at the foot of the stairs, mustard cardigan tucked into his sweatpants, calling her a spoiled brat. How dare he? She had grown up, walking each morning to the family bakery, switching on the tiny incandescent bulbs of the Marconi sign, rolling dough, cleaning display cases, wiping down the aluminum cladding on the storefront. Maybe she hadn't given work at the baker her all over the past year, but after what had happened, spoiled brat my ass. The dog perked as Fritz keyed the engine. The ferry horn blew, and her anger grew hot in her chest. And there, at the far end of the heat, something quieter and reassuring. An attendant stretched a chain across the pedestrian entrance, as if to say, no, you're not crossing these 3,500 miles back to Philadelphia. Not yet. And she opened the door and got in. That's all in there. And I'll just say, you guys are so lucky. We are so lucky to be here, and I am incredibly honored to be sharing the stage with Chris Cleave. I've read his book, Everyone Brave is Forgiven, and it is a wonderful, moving book. The only terrible part about it is when it ends. It's one of these books that brings you into a very particular world, Great Britain and Malta, and also a particular time period, World War II, and there's this heavy sadness when you reach the last word, but that is a happiness for you because it's sitting up there on the table and you can jump into that world. So, Chris Cleave.
I enjoyed your novel so much, Brendan. It's so beautifully written, so assured, so strong, so even. I didn't know until afterwards that it was a debut. I couldn't believe it. It's an incredibly beautiful piece of art and very moving. It does what all of the best pieces of work do. It makes room in your heart. It takes you to a place you haven't been before, and makes you feel that you're there and you're rooting for the characters and you want them to come through. And it was beautiful. So, it's mutual admiration, and thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Rick, for that great introduction. Thank you for enjoying the weather that we have brought for you. Usually, I can blame this on myself, coming from London, where it rains all the time. But in this case, when you invite a writer from London and a writer based in Alaska, this is, I think, the kind of weather you can expect. But I'll apologize anyway, because it's in my national character to do that. I wrote a book based on my grandparents. This book is called Everyone Brave is Forgiven. It's my fourth novel. It's the first one where I've really dealt with my family. And if you want to look back where my family comes from, they came through the war. And, we're a London family. It's based on my maternal grandparents, my grandfather and grandmother. My grandfather had a very engaged war. He was in an elite service, a parachute service called the SAS. His selection procedure for that was that he was dropped behind enemy lines, and anyone who came back to the British lines was in the SAS. Congratulations. They did things differently in those days. His first drop behind enemy lines, apparently they were all quite nervous in the back of the plane, and the sergeant major put their minds at rest by saying, "Never mind, boys, if your parachutes do not open, you can just take them back to the packing shed." They were funny in the war. It's what got them through. I remember when I was very young asking my grandfather what was the bravest thing he'd ever done in the war. And I was hoping for a story that was going to involve, bullets, planes, tanks, at the very minimum. He said, "Well, something brave I did was ask your grandmother to marry me." She was an amazing woman. She's in this book too. She's become a character called Mary North in the book. My real grandmother was a fiercely independent, very strong woman. She was a teacher, and during the war she taught children in and around London. And after the war, she set up a school called a kindergarten, based on the German principle of educating very young children. And you can imagine how popular this was in an absolutely destroyed London. In 1946, she said, I think the Germans were very good at raising children." And she was right. It was a beautiful school. It wasn't based on academics. It was based on giving the child a full and rounded development, and she made a success of it. But that's what she was like. She was the kind of person who went against every available grain. And she was fierce. And my grandfather took his courage in his hand at one point and went down on one knee and said, "Mary, would you do me the great honor of being my wife?" And she looked at him as if the idea had never once occurred to her. And she said, "Oh, David, that would be marvelous. Let's do just that." And so they were married. And they really did live happily ever after. But first of all, they were separated by the war for 3.5 years. And I discovered this huge trove of letters between them, between David and Mary, my real-life grandparents. And they were astonishing, and they were deep, and they were subtle, and I realized there was an emotional complexity in that generation that never somehow made it into the war movies. And I wanted to write about the war. I wanted to write about the bravery that it had taken to get through that, but I wanted not just to write about action, I wanted to write about the quiet moments in between, where people found their courage and gave each other the strength to carry on. I wanted to find something beautiful and creative and familial in the heart of that conflict, because it's where we all came from. I'll read you a little bit from the book without further ado. This is a part of the book where my two lovers, who are inspired by my grandparents but not based on them, have just slept together, just spent the night together for the first time. And I want you all to cast your minds back. And they wake up and they decide that they'll go out for a walk together in the streets of London. The streets were nearly empty. London was theirs alone. And if from time to time it pleased the lovers that a bread van should drive past on its rounds, or a policeman walk by on his beat, or the last fox of the night nose for scraps in an alley, then they caused it to be so. They strolled until the sidewalks grew busy around them and the traffic began to clot in the streets. They walked, and they didn't need anything at all, until very suddenly they needed everything. They understood that they were famished, and so they ran into a cafe and ate like wolves, and they drank dark stewed tea that made their teeth buzz in their sockets. Afterwards, he decided that he must absolutely buy her a book, and she decided that she must absolutely buy him a paper knife, and they went in and out of shops until these things were done, and then they were calm again. They sat together on a bench in Trafalgar Square, holding the new things in their hands and being delighted with them, while Tom also felt solemn. In a way that had no limiting degree, they watched the pigeons flock. She yawned and laid her head on his shoulder. "Are you tired?" he said. "Shall we go back to the flat and sleep?" "I ought to go home," she said. "Palmer will fret." The distance between them was nothing, and simultaneously it was so huge that in the moment she couldn't speak of it. She felt a heavy sadness. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking how glad I am. What are you thinking?" He was considering the idea of her having a home and a pet and two parents. He hadn't given any thought at all to the concept that she hadn't simply materialized in the world at 18 in perfect crimson lipstick, laughing at the exact spatial coordinates and the exact time at which he'd met her. She was so perfectly unique that the idea of her being made ordinary by friends, and worse, by family, made his chest sink unbearably. He said, "Yeah, the same. I'm feeling so glad." She kissed him. She said, "I should go." "Oh, yes," he said, "yes, of course." He gave her an anxious look. "What do you suppose you should tell your family?" She stroked his cheek. "I shall tell Father I stayed overnight with my friend Hilda. I shall tell Mother that you're lovely." "You'll tell her?" "Oh, yes, women share everything. It's the blessing we received when we turned down muscles and moustaches." He squeezed her hand. He said, "I'll walk you to the tube." She didn't tell him that she never caught the tube. She wondered whether even one bought a ticket beforehand, or whether there was an inspector who came through the carriage. They got up from the bench and they walked back across Trafalgar Square, breaking into a run to scare the pigeons. And they ran, breathless and laughing and desperately sad, with their hands clasped tight and the birds clattering up before them. They flocked and swirled and ascended through the city's blanketing cloud, emerging into the sky. A life, unmoored from the embattled earth, a thing begun again, looping and wheeling in the Pacific air. Mary held tight to Tom's hand and thought it heartless that the two of them had to stay below in London. She said, "I'll go, I'll be fine from here." He said, "I wish you didn't have to go." "Well, it's just until Monday," she said. "Come and pick me up after work." "Yes," he said, "but will you be all right?" She said, "Why would I not be all right?" He thought about her question. In fact, there were so many reasons. Of course, there was the war, which might bring death from the sky at any time. Then there were orders, which could come quite arbitrarily, posting either of them to another city or another country, where distance would begin its work of transforming a lover's hand into handwriting. And then there were mechanical accidents. Machinery was well known to be full of spite for slim bodies such as the one he clung to. Bearings lived to seize, axles to shear, cables to snap. Accidents of the heart were a worry too. She was beautiful. Other men could see this as well as he. She was bright and unconventional, and her faithfulness could not be assumed. There would come suitors who were taller or richer, or, more dreadful of all, who could make her laugh. How he feared men who could make her laugh. And next there was disease, less of a threat than good humor, but still not to be entirely discounted. Influenza came once in each generation and was overdue in theirs. Cancer or consumption might take her. A scratch on her finger might fester, a cold sore give ingress to a greater cold. And then there was a whole category of mishaps inseparable from physics. The tumble, the slip and the choke, collision, combustion and shock. And he couldn't even begin to quantify the risks posed by third parties. Friends might queer her affections. Fiends in alleyways might murder her, or worse. Her parents, picking from a list of his faults, might seize on his pacifism or his poverty. They might set about dissuading their daughter, using all the tricks of their art. It was not a level playing field where parents were concerned. They had known her in every year of her life. He, not yet in every season of 1 year. And finally, there were the imponderables of memory and the psyche. She could wake up tomorrow with no recollection that she'd ever known him. Or she could walk past a cafe and stop dead in her tracks, overcome by desire for the waiter. And worse than all of these things, because so much more likely were the mundane human dissatisfactions that absence would allow to incubate. What if he said something to unsettle her? A single word could be enough. And what if she, now brooding on it, came to decide that he didn't truly love her? Or what if he'd been unsatisfactory in bed? The more he thought about it, the more he worried that there was something he should have done but had not. Or worse, something that he'd done too much of. These were only the first thoughts that came. The more he considered it, oh God, her lovely face with that mocking little grin, the more causes there were for anxiety. Separation was air in the lungs of fate, and so when it was time for them to part after their first night together, and he asked her, "Will you be all right?" and she replied, "Well, why would I not be?" In fact, so many reasons presented themselves that it began to seem fantastically improbable, if he let go of her warm hand now and allowed her to walk away into this grey morning that smelled of spring, that they would ever see each other again. It seemed so much safer to stay close and let the great disintegrating power of the world do its work on other lovers instead. But since he didn't know how to put all of this in a way that wouldn't seem pathetic, he simply said, "All right, I'll see you on Monday." It wasn't the same as charging down a machine gun nest armed only with a Bowie knife, or strapping into the tail gunner seat of a 4-engined heavy bomber. And no one else would ever know, since one didn't get a medal for letting go of a woman's hand on a grey Saturday morning in the middle of a European war. But to have faith that a lover would be constant and life clement, this did require courage in a city more disposed to beginnings than safe continuations. As she walked away from him, he turned his back to show that he could. For her part, Mary didn't find it at all difficult to walk away from Tom. She simply walked for a while, wearing yesterday's clothes. Yes, the war was a blind roulette. Yes, the city was full of beautiful women who might tempt him, some of them more thrilling than she was, a few of them already wearing summer dresses. But it all weighed less heavily on her, since weightlessness was in her nature, and in any case one simply had to live. Oh, and yet, darling, she called, spinning round. The crowd had taken him, though. She had imagined that he would still be standing there, watching her. And now she felt a dreadful uncertainty about love.
Thank you very much. Two exceptional readings by two exceptional authors. I have this standard question for both. One, what other writers, if any, are your influences? And two, how did each of you negotiate perhaps the male problem of creating female characters?
Sure, I can start off. I mean, you know, Rick, as in America, I mean, you have this ghost of Hemingway that you just have to get into the ring and box with, right? So he's always there, but more as somebody you're just going 10 rounds with than anything else. More contemporary folks, Michael Ondaatje, bowls me over. There's a Canadian author, Anne Michaels, who wrote one novel, Fugitive Pieces, that I was totally taken with. James Salter. Those are probably the folks I come back to constantly. And I don't know about you, Chris. As far as a female protagonist, if you had told me 10 years ago that I was going to write a female protagonist, I would have laughed in your face. I'd say there's no way, you know. I started off with 10 characters, and I gave about 10,000 words to each, and then started just colliding them together. And it was kind of like a war of attrition, one by one. They dropped off, and when I got an agent for the book, it was actually, there was a Cuban in there, Santiago, who I actually missed dearly in the book. And he dropped off when I got the editor at Houghton Mifflin, who said, you know, I think this might just be a novel about Tara. And all of a sudden I looked up, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm writing a female protagonist. And that's what I was left with, and at the end it made perfect sense.
It's fascinating to, can you hear me on this? It's fascinating to hear your process, because she seems so fully realized and so fully formed, Tara. She's an incredible character, and she's strong without being vicious. You know, she keeps a really good distance between herself and the other characters when she needs to, but she's capable of this incredible warmth too. It's amazing to hear that that's the last thing you were planning. It seems like her story from the beginning.
Yeah, that's nice to hear. She kind of emerged, but when I stepped back, it was like she was the last one standing. Like she was the one supposed to be there, that was supposed to be there. I'm curious, did you start with Mary as the one?
Yeah, I think I've always started with female protagonists in my novels. It started as a way of making sure I wasn't writing about myself. I had a rule that whenever I picked up the pen, I would cross one line that I shouldn't really cross, you know, of gender, of race, of sexuality, of religion, you know, that I would be someone I wasn't, because it forces me to observe, it forces me to listen, it forces me to understand a character, and that's why I got into it. And then I kind of got addicted to it, you know. It's like I have this whole literary wardrobe full of outfits.
I have one friend who, when he has to kill a character, he dresses up in a really nice suit. And he sits down at the typewriter and takes a deep breath and does it, you know. But they become so much just a part of you and so close to you.
Yeah. So he's planning it. I mean, that's premeditation, isn't it?
Yeah, I think he knows it's going to happen, but he probably fights against it for a bit. Yeah.
It's tough, isn't it, when you have to take one out, you know, and they're you know, because you do get really attached to your characters. It's interesting to hear you say that there was this sort of Darwinian battle between them, and the strong ones survived. And I get that too. You know, you find out who are your major and who are your minors, you know, by the things they come out with. And sometimes, yeah, you do. You have to cast yourself in the role of this, you know, almost a Bond villain who plots how you're going to take one out.
Yeah,
and writing a novel set in the war was particular. You know, that was a really acute point. You did have to work out how to take people unfairly and arbitrarily out of the narrative, and it hurts. You know?
Oh, there was that one friend of Alistair's who he meets in training, who it's downright cruel what you do. I mean, I really shouldn't say. Read the book; it's really hard, but it's cruel what you do to that guy.
I learned it from Norman Mailer in The Naked and the Dead. I mean, this extraordinary novel. Sorry, spoiler warning. He takes out his protagonist before the end of the book. You know, this shocking, arbitrary thing he does. You're really involved in the narrative, and suddenly the character's gone, like taken out cruelly, unfairly, randomly, and yet the book rolls on. You know, the book carries on, almost empty in its last part. And it struck me as the most honest way to write about war. So I took that.
Did the two of you know each other before yesterday? I mean, did you have reasons to know each other?
We'd read each other's books, and that we met for the first time yesterday. And yeah, it was. But I think you know people quite well through their work. You know, I don't really believe there's that much separation between a writer and their work. And I think if you've read the book, you know the person pretty well. You know, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors, but really that's them. Yeah, is that fair? I guess.
Yeah, I think you get a sense of the shape of somebody's heart reading their book. That said, there are a couple authors I've been really excited to meet and have been pretty disappointed. Their shapes were not very nice. But I think for the most part, and it definitely goes with Everyone Brave is Forgiven, there's a sense of overwhelming empathy, and I think Chris was just alluding to it, really wanting to push those boundaries and cross that line that, unless you have a real generous spirit, generosity of spirit, it's hard to do that.
I mean, that comes across in your work as well. It's always, you always hold back from the real cruelties that the characters could vest upon each other. You're always looking for the kindness that they're showing each other in this bleak and really hostile environment. And you manage to show them struggling against something that's elemental, rather than needing to have a villain. I mean, that's what's great. Your book doesn't have a villain. It doesn't need one. You know, they're good people who encounter hardship despite the fact they're all trying to get through, and they're all mostly trying to help each other. It's a big-hearted novel in that sense.
Can you join me for the rest of the tour? And we can
we could do this. We should get banjos.
I wonder, could you both talk a bit about the geography of your novels, or maybe a sense of place is a better way of describing it, and how either you chose that place or it chose you, and then how it came to define the book in some way?
Alaska was, my original novel, I should back up and say that I tried to put Hamlet in the woods of Alaska. Didn't work. It just didn't work at all. But I always knew I wanted to write about Alaska. And originally the book, there were a lot more scenes in Philly. There was one on Rittenhouse Square. Tara got hit by a SEPTA at one point. That got taken out. There was just much more Philly in it, but I guess, like we were talking about, that war of attrition with characters, places just kept on peeling off, and all of a sudden it was just Alaska. It's been really interesting to me to see how the book has been received in Alaska. And I did a reading there, and shortly after the reading, this was when I was still calling it Sitka, and I was naming specific places. And I mentioned DeGraaf Bay. You know, this is where you get beach asparagus. I really wanted to get place perfect. And I mentioned Redoubt Falls, like this is where you go to dip net sockeye. and somebody took me aside afterward, a native, a Tlingit, and said, "You need to change these names. This is knowledge that you only earn by becoming part of the community and going out there, somebody sharing this with you." And I flinched at doing that, but then I did, especially after reading, I don't know if people have read Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael Chabon. He sets this Rooseveltian fantasy of having a Jewish homeland in southeast Alaska in Sitka, and he uses the name Sitka, and this takes place in the 20s, but there were people in the 20s who were living in Sitka, and so he really elides their lived experience there. So that's another reason I wanted to change it. And then I guess the last thing I'll say about just Alaska and place is there's a myth in the book, the story of Lenexidak, this curly-haired woman, and I put that in and was again told that you can't just put stories in your book that don't belong to you. And, you know, coming from Philly, I'm like, what are you talking about? Put whatever I want in my book. But then settled down and had some more serious conversations. And I really realized, you know, when people say, Robert Hass said that the Alaska has yet to be imagined. I mean, people have been there 10,000 years making these beautiful myths, and they're so braided into their existence up there. You don't necessarily have the rights just to take from these myths. So I ended up speaking with folks at Sitka Tribe of Alaska and talking to them, and it turns out they didn't really remember the myth, and I ended up being able to put it in my book. But yeah, that was interesting how that took place.
Yeah, places. London for me, it's always London. All of my novels are set in London, or they're about London, or they're about a dream of coming to London, or a dream of leaving London. And when I write about London, you know, which is a city that chose me, you know, I was born there. I keep coming back to it. I'm fascinated by it because it continually regenerates itself. It's never the same. It's come back from everything. It's come back from fire. It's come back from plague. It's come back from hysteria. It's come back from Margaret Thatcher's government. It's a survivor. And I think its people are survivors. And you know, there are 300 languages spoken in London. It's a world city. It's a hub. And so when I'm writing about London, I'm writing about a universal city. You know, I'm writing about my Platonic ideal of our civilization and what it can be. So I'm writing about us when I write about London. I'm writing about all of us. Because if it can't happen in London, it can't happen. And that's what fascinates me about the place. So yeah, London, very deep in my heart and very deep in the novels. And in this one, I've broken it. You know, this city that's been built up for hundreds of years, you know, smash it page by page. It's getting more and more smashed until it's just rubble. And then the question that you ask your people in the book is, well, what are you going to do with that now? How are you going to rebuild that? You know, let's see how you like that. And what fascinates is how they go about doing that. You know, how given that you've reduced this universal Platonic city to rubble, how are these people going to rebuild it? What is the direction that they see their civilization going into? And that's why it's interesting to write about a place. It's why it's interesting to write about a period in history. Because you're always writing about now. Really, you're always writing about here, now, the time you're writing in. And you're asking these questions of, you know, once you've reduced this to ash, where do you want to take it next?
This is a question for Chris. You alluded to letters between your grandparents. I wondered if you considered doing the book as a memoir, using those letters and the actual circumstances that surrounded their lives. First of all, and since you didn't, why you didn't do that, and since you didn't go that route, did you still make use of the letters, the actual letters in the book? Are they quoted?
It's such a great question. Thank you for that. I did originally try to do it as a very lightly fictionalized version of my grandparents' real story. My grandfather in particular had a fascinating story. When he was besieged on the island of Malta for a while, he was given the job of looking after the Prime Minister's son. This was a gentleman called Randolph Churchill, who was Winston Churchill's brilliant but rather dissipated and disturbed son. He was great in his own right, but he had big shoes to fill. You know, Winston Churchill was this revered wartime leader, and it was really impossible to be his equal. And my grandfather was given the job of looking after him and making sure he didn't get into trouble, which was a hard thing to do because Randolph was fantastically brave. You know, he would walk into gunfire to deliver orders, and it was hard to keep him out of trouble. So I started out telling that real story and very lightly fictionalizing it and making it this very interesting power play between the two men, because my grandfather really had his head screwed on and was kind of in control of that situation tactically, whereas Randolph was immensely more powerful and influential than my grandfather. So it was an interesting play. But then I realized that out of the two, the person I was more interested in was my grandfather, because he had an ordinary life and a small life, you know, like I do. That he was a person in history rather than a big current of history itself. And so it became an intimate story about family. And as soon as it became that, I realized that it would be all about dialogue and the way people spoke, and I wasn't there for any of it. At that point, I realized that it had to be fiction rather than memoir, or even sort of lightly fictionalized memoir. And I did make use of the letters that they wrote to each other, but only in terms of their tone. I felt it wouldn't be respectful to the real people to drop their letters in, because quite interestingly, in terms of Brendan's point, there are stories that don't belong to me. You know, those are grandparents that I share with 7 other grandchildren, and it wasn't for me to just lift their lives wholesale and put them into a book. I felt that I didn't have the right to do it. So I've kept really close to this line that I draw inspiration from their characters, but I haven't based the story on their lives. And that was, for me, a way to honor them without usurping their real story. Sorry, long and rambling answer to a great question.
Brendan, you mentioned earlier that your novel has an epistolary structure to it, and I wonder how you came to that.
I think it's a great technique for telling a story, just being able to see one character through the eyes of the other. I just love letters. I wrote a lot of them when I was in high school, and there's a break when you receive a letter, this kind of space before you reply, and there's this wondering what the other person's thinking and how you're going to respond, and I think a lot happens that's actually missed with emails, and so part of it was just I guess a nostalgia for letters a little bit, but again, also just a great narrative device.
Brendan, I found it very interesting reading your book. Chris, I haven't read yours. That the female main character, Tara, starts out fairly damaged and emotionally unhinged in some ways. But instead of talking about that directly, it seemed to me that she dealt with it through her physical activity, that it was just such a hard thing. Her various boating experiences, her various jobs that were just such hard work, and living out in the land. And I wondered if that was something you thought about a lot, that the hard work was a way of working through her emotional issues.
Absolutely, and it's so great to hear that you felt that came across. I mean, I love this. This is an Aristotelian idea that action equals character, and I also love the idea of just trusting readers to use their imaginative powers to come up with their own story. So I'm also not great at interiority. I'm just not great at writing it. So I really like depending on just physical movement as a way to express something that the character's going through, and also to just allow a reader to come up with their own responses or what might be going on in the head of the character. And the pitfall of that, of course, is when you lose control as a reader and all of a sudden, as a writer, and all of a sudden the reader doesn't feel in safe hands because they're not getting any direction or signposts. So it's nice to feel like you felt there was that space in the novel.
And with the chime of the bell, our time is up. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Chris Cleave, Brendan Jones.